I'm looking at a headline from the Washington Post. 1 in 6 Gen Z adults are LGBT. And this number could continue to grow. Gen Z are 18 to 23-year-olds. 18 to 23-year-olds. So this is Gallup data, so it's reputable. And the Gallup data says that Americans 18 and older, the number is 5.6%. 5.6% of U.S. adults identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. This is the equivalent of me using power tools at home when my wife is always reaching for 911 at the mere, sight of a drill or, God forbid, an electric saw. Such is the trepidation with which I do math on air. But I need to just do a little ciphering for a moment. So 1 in 6 would be, let me just see, what percent? 1 in 6. So just carry that and put the 3 over there and by 5. Well, I'm coming up with 16.6%. Can that be right? Let me just think about it. If it were 1 in 5, it would be 20%. So 1 in 6 has to be less than 20. Yeah, 16.6%. How could the figure be for all adults 18 or older 5.6%, but for 18 to 23-year-olds be 16.6%? Kerith Conron may have the answer. Kerith Conron is the research director of the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law and joins me now. Thank you so much for your time. This data is really of interest, isn't it?
I think it's fascinating, and it's definitely fun to talk about.
Kerith, am I reading it the same way as you, that there's a significant, hence the headline, right, in the Washington Post, that there's a pretty startling revelation relative to Gen Z as compared to other generations?
Well, this is, for those of us who look at survey data often, this isn't a big surprise. We've seen growth among high school age people who are now identifying as LGB. That percentage has been growing over time from about 8% in 2015 to just over 11% in 2019.
Commonsensically,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
Similarly, we see large percentages of people in the 18 to 24-year-old range identifying as LGBT, just over 10%. And some of the data that I'm looking at are from 2017. What Gallup just produced is from 2020. And so we are seeing a positive linear trend in the proportion of the population that's identifying as LGBT, particularly among high school folks and young adults.
So intuitively, I would think, but I lack expertise, I'm just spitballing here, but intuitively, I would think that the number of individuals who are LGBT, it seems to me, would be a static number, that there'd be some constancy if we were to go back 50 years or 100 years. Maybe I'm wrong. What might account for higher reporting? Maybe that's acceptance. Might that be the answer?
Well, I think that's a great theory. We've been looking at survey data for a long time, and 30 years ago, when surveys were asking people about same-gender sexual attraction or desire or even behavior, far more people were reporting any same-gender interest than they were reporting lesbian, gay, or bisexual identity at that point in time. So the fact that we're seeing an increase in identification does make sense as far as aligning with probably what's been a more stable amount of same-gender attraction or desire over time.
Said simply, Gallup in 2017 got a survey number of 4.5% who said they identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Now it's more recently 5.6%. Do you know if we went back 10, 20, 30, some other time frame, what that number would be?
If we went back about 10 years, we'd probably be looking at 3%. If we went back a little bit before that, maybe 15 years, maybe we'd be looking at closer to 2%. So there definitely is, a positive linear trend, this increase we see over time.
It has to be that people just weren't being honest, don't you think?
Oh, I don't know about honesty. I mean, you have to think about how the world treats you and reacts to you. So I think some of it is self-preservation, right?
Right.
I think most individuals have a good sense of their environments and whether or not it's safe to be out. I think that's a big piece of it.
Right, but it's not as if the number of LGBT among us has tripled in the span of 15 years. I mean, how could we possibly explain that?
I think, it's probably more people being aware of same-gender desire earlier on in the life course and feeling more capable of coming out and living lives that maybe are more authentic than some of the lives that people in prior generations had to live, where they came out in adulthood.
So if that's the explanation, and it makes intuitive sense to me, one wonders where the trajectory takes us, right? If 15 years ago, 2% were so identifying, 10%, 10 years ago, 3%, now we're at 5.6. Like, where are we 5 years into the future? When do we get the real number?
Well, I think we could collect some newer data about sexual attraction to people of the same or different genders or both, and that would give us, I think, a better underlying sense of the potential population that might one day identify as sexual minorities. And then an issue that we really haven't talked much about is gender identity and how that's actually different from sexual orientation. And yet we lump the T's on the LGBs when we have some of these conversations. Well,
explain that to me, because I want to make sure that I understand it.
Well, people who are transgender experience a difference between the sex they were assigned at birth and the way they currently identify their gender and express it to themselves or to other people. So there's a discordance between a sex assigned at birth and current gender identity, where current gender identity is either different or it's more expansive than the gender identity that one would presume might be linked with a particular sex.
And is your thought that the increase in percentage who so identify similarly is one born of increased acceptance?
Again, I think it's awareness. I think people have more access to concepts and role models. I think there's a lot more coverage, on TV shows and social media of people who are transgender, including people who are gender non-binary in their identity and their expression. And so it's making it more possible for young people and older people, too, to identify themselves and to identify with that experience. And with more resources and greater support and acceptance, to maybe come out and try to live as transgender in a public way.
This is Kerith Conron, the research director at the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law. By the way, what does the Williams Institute do?
We study law and public policy and how it impacts the LGBT population.
One other question, if I may, on this new Gallup data. The subcategory, I guess I should describe it as, of bisexual people. What do you see vis-a-vis Gen Z for bisexuals? Because more than half of the LGBT adults so identify.
Well, what we really see is that this increase in the percentage of the population that's LGBT is being driven by girls and young women who are self-identifying as bisexual. So that's really what's driving this phenomenon that we see. There is an increase in boys and young men who identify as bisexual, but it's predominantly among girls and young adult women. This is something I think we need to understand more about. What we know is how people will self-identify in surveys. What I'd love to know is if people are using these terms to identify themselves in their daily lives, if this is an acknowledgement of same-gender attraction, how this links up with lived experience, how it links up with community affiliation. I think it's just raising lots of interesting questions about, what identification means at this point in time. But I also think it's profound. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, from the Washington Post, to the point you are making, more than half of LGBT adults identify as bisexual, while a quarter say they are gay, 12% identify as lesbian, 11% as transgender, and 3% as another term such as queer. That means that 3.1% of Americans identify as bisexual. And you say that among, I know we're speaking in generalities here, but girls and young women are the ones driving the rise of that self-identification.
Oh, absolutely. In 2019, about 14% of high school girls checked that they were bisexual on a sexual orientation identity question. And then if you look at young adults who are 18 to 24, at least in 2017, 2018, this is another data set. So what I'm trying to suggest is that data is converging to show a similar pattern. More than 1 in 10 18 to 24-year-old women were self-identifying as bisexual. So this is here. I mean, we're seeing it in lots of different data sets.
Kerith,
I will also say that acknowledgement of same-gender attraction has been higher for girls and women for some time. So in some ways, perhaps this shouldn't be surprising.
Kerith, this has been great. Sum up. What's the takeaway that you find most significant as one who spends a lot of time parsing this data?
For me, it begs schools and pediatricians and parents to get informed about sexuality, to get informed about what it means to be transgender, because you're going to see lots and lots of young people who are living at home in high school and early adolescence needing support, because coming out is still a difficult process. Being in school is still a difficult process. People still get bullied. So victimization, suicidality, these are real concerns for LGBT young people. And so we really need to increase competence and support and resources and protections for LGBT young people at home, schools, and in their neighborhoods.
Well, that was well said. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Kerith Conron, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't that interesting? 15 years, round numbers, okay? Round numbers. 15 years ago, how many are identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender in America? 2%. 10 years ago, 3%. Year ago, 4.5%. Now we're at 5.6%. Where does it tap out? And what's the real number? Among young people, might it be, I hope this doesn't sound ridiculous, but might it be that the numbers at some point are overinflated? In other words, when she says that
people are just exploring their sexuality, so they say there's something and then they maybe aren't really. Is that what you're thinking?
Could there even be a sort of panache to identifying as bisexual as a young woman?
Well, I think it depends where you are in the country, too.
No doubt. More than half of LGBT adults identify as bisexual. And she said that these numbers in the Gen Z are particularly rising.
We've learned so much in the last 10 years, 5 years, 15 years. I mean, think about it. How much we've learned about sexuality and gender. Terms we didn't know about, understanding where sexuality and gender come from, understanding the fluidity of sexuality, and that people are on a spectrum of where they are versus, with same-sex attraction versus heterosexuality. It's fascinating to me. And I think when you are aware of that spectrum, then you become much more comfortable saying that you could maybe be bisexual. Let
me go back to where I began. 5.6% of U.S. adults, simplify because a lot of data just came out, 5.6% of U.S. adults so identify. I don't want to keep repeating it. 5.6%. Among Gen Z, 18 to 23-year-olds, the number is 16.6%. It can't be a generational thing, right? It's not like in the span of human evolution, all of a sudden we're becoming more LGBT. That doesn't make any sense to me. It has to be an acceptance thing, which is what I was saying to my guest, that people are just more comfortable
and I think
in
when
being
you
honest
said,
reporters.
But I think when you said honest, she took that as some sort of negative initially. And what you meant was what she was saying, which is comfortable being able to say it.
Yes.
But I think she took that as like you were saying something negative about the person who was being, quote unquote, dishonest. Well, it's not that they're being dishonest. It's that they understand the ramifications for coming out and say.
How about if I said accurate? I'm not speaking.
I knew you weren't being judgmental at all.
No.
I totally get it.
No, but it's not an honest figure. If the figure is 2% 15 years ago and now it's 16.6% among Gen Z, somebody wasn't telling the truth.
Well,
maybe for good reason.
Of course, for good reason. Look at the news. Okay. My God, look what's happening. I mean, everywhere, and this is crazy.
Ladies and gentlemen,